Have you ever noticed how easily you convince yourself to stay quiet? How fast the inner voice appears and whispers, "It's not worth it. Let it go. Be the bigger person." And in that moment, you retreat. You swallow the sentence that wanted to be spoken. You suppress the reaction that rose instinctively. You bury the boundary that was about to be drawn. At first, it feels like wisdom, like emotional maturity, like strength. But what if that silence isn't strength at all? What if it's fear, carefully disguised as virtue? Tonight, we're going to talk about something uncomfortable, something most people avoid naming: your fear of conflict. Not the loud kind, not shouting or fighting or chaos, but the quiet everyday conflict, saying no, expressing disagreement, defending your dignity, standing your ground when something inside you says, "This is not right." Because every time you don't do that, something subtle happens. You don't just avoid tension, you abandon yourself. And over time, that abandonment shapes your personality, your relationships, your self-respect, and even how much life you allow yourself to live. This video is not about becoming aggressive. It's not about dominating others. It's not about being reckless or cruel. It's about understanding why you were taught to fear confrontation, how that fear rewires your psychology, and how reclaiming the ability to face conflict is essential for a full, dignified life. If you stay until the end, you won't just understand this intellectually. You'll see your own behavior differently. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. From childhood, most of us are trained into a single lesson: don't cause problems. We're praised for being agreeable, rewarded for being polite, encouraged to suppress anger, disagreement, and resistance. We learn early that love, approval, and safety are conditional. They depend on how easy we are to handle. So we adapt. We become careful, measured, emotionally restrained. We learn to anticipate reactions before we speak, to soften our truth, to filter ourselves so we don't upset the emotional atmosphere around us. And eventually, we stop noticing that we're doing it. Silence becomes automatic. But here's the uncomfortable truth: much of what we call kindness is not kindness at all. It's avoidance. Avoidance of discomfort, avoidance of rejection, avoidance of being misunderstood or disliked, avoidance of conflict. And when avoidance becomes a moral identity, when you start believing that staying silent makes you better than others, it quietly transforms into something corrosive. You start to believe that enduring disrespect is noble, that tolerating injustice is maturity, that suppressing anger is wisdom. But suppressed anger doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And what accumulates doesn't stay quiet forever. Every human being is born with a natural impulse to assert themselves. This isn't a flaw. It isn't cruelty. It isn't violence. It's life. You see it in children who say no before they learn politeness, in animals defending territory, in creativity, ambition, exploration, and growth. Psychologically, this assertive impulse is what allows you to set boundaries, protect your energy, define who you are, say this matters and this does not. When this impulse is allowed expression, it becomes clarity, confidence, and self-respect. But when it's blocked, repeatedly, it doesn't vanish. It turns inward. Instead of becoming action, it becomes tension. Instead of movement, it becomes rumination. Instead of strength, it becomes bitterness. You replay conversations in your head. You imagine what you should have said. You feel irritated for hours or days over small moments. And slowly, something changes. You begin to associate self-expression with danger, assertion with guilt, conflict with shame. So you retreat further. And the more you retreat, the harder it becomes to speak at all. This is how passivity forms, not as weakness, but as learned self-protection. At some point, silence stops feeling like a choice. It becomes an identity. You start telling yourself stories. I'm just not confrontational. I prefer peace. I rise above petty conflict. These stories feel comforting. They make your fear sound intentional. They turn avoidance into virtue. But psychologically, this is often a defense mechanism. When someone feels unable to act, they reinterpret inaction as moral superiority. Not because they're dishonest, but because the alternative would be too painful. It would mean admitting, I didn't speak because I was afraid. So instead, the mind reframes fear as goodness. This is one of the most subtle and powerful self-deceptions humans are capable of, and it comes at a cost. Because while your conscious mind tells a story of virtue, your nervous system remembers the truth. It remembers the moment you froze, the moment you felt small, the moment you abandoned your boundary, and that memory accumulates. Resentment is not anger. Anger is active. It wants movement. It wants resolution. Resentment is anger that has nowhere to go. It's the emotional residue left behind when action is suppressed. You see it when people complain endlessly but never change anything. When they criticize others while avoiding responsibility. When they carry a quiet hostility beneath a polite surface. Resentment feeds on comparison, on silent judgment, on moral superiority. It whispers, I suffer more than others. I'm better because I endure. One day they'll see. But that day never comes, because resentment doesn't liberate, it imprisons. The more resentment builds, the less courage you have. The less courage you have, the more resentment grows. It's a closed loop, and eventually people adapt to this inner state. They build an identity around it. They become the good one, the selfless one, the patient one. But underneath that identity is often exhaustion, bitterness, and unexpressed rage. Here's where the narrative needs to change. Conflict is not the opposite of peace. Avoidance is. Real peace is not the absence of tension. It's the presence of truth. Conflict, when faced consciously, does something powerful. It clarifies boundaries. It reveals values. It forces growth. Without conflict, nothing sharpens. Nothing differentiates. Nothing becomes real. Psychologically, avoiding all conflict is equivalent to refusing to define yourself. You remain vague, flexible, undefined, easy to coexist with, but difficult to respect. This is why people who never assert themselves often feel invisible, because they never fully arrive. Reclaiming your assertive energy does not mean becoming aggressive. Aggression is uncontrolled force. Assertion is directed force. The difference is awareness. Assertion says, this is my boundary. This is my position. This is where I stand. It does not need to shout. It does not need to humiliate. It does not need to dominate. But it must be willing to withstand discomfort. The discomfort of being disliked, of being misunderstood, of not being universally approved. This is the price of self-respect, and it's a price most people were never taught how to pay. Psychologically, the journey out of passivity often unfolds in stages. First is endurance. This is the phase where you carry expectations, obligations, and unspoken rules. You endure, you adapt, you survive. Then comes resistance. Something inside you grows tired. You begin to say no, awkwardly, imperfectly, sometimes angrily. You feel guilt, but also relief. This phase is unstable, necessary, uncomfortable. Finally comes integration. You no longer assert yourself reactively. You don't need to prove anything. You speak when it matters and stay silent when it doesn't. Not from fear, but from choice. This is where strength becomes calm. Start small. Say no when you mean no. Express disagreement without apologizing for existing. Set boundaries before resentment builds. Notice where your body tightens when you want to speak, and speak anyway. Let the discomfort pass. Each time you do this, you teach your nervous system something new. I can survive this. And slowly, fear loosens its grip. At this point, something important needs to be addressed. Even when people intellectually understand everything we've discussed, many still resist change. Not because they disagree, but because transformation threatens something deeper than comfort. It threatens identity. For years, maybe decades, you may have built a self-image around being easygoing, low maintenance, or the reasonable one. Others may rely on you in that role. They may benefit from your silence. They may feel safer when you don't push back. When you begin to assert yourself, even gently, the system reacts. People may accuse you of changing, of becoming selfish, of being difficult. And here's the hard truth. They're not reacting to your aggression. They're reacting to your autonomy. Psychologically, systems resist disruption. Families, workplaces, friendships, all unconsciously settle into balance. When you stop absorbing pressure, that pressure doesn't disappear. It moves outward, and not everyone will like that. This is why growth often feels lonely at first. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're no longer playing the role that made others comfortable. Understanding this ahead of time prevents self-betrayal. It keeps you from retreating back into silence just to restore familiar harmony, because that harmony was never neutral. It was built on your suppression. One of the most common fears people have is this: if I assert myself, I'll push people away. And sometimes, yes, you will. But not because you're becoming closed, because you're becoming defined. A boundary is not a wall. A boundary doesn't say, keep out. It says, this is where I end. Walls are built from fear. Boundaries are built from clarity. When you lack boundaries, you overextend. You absorb emotions that aren't yours. You feel responsible for everyone's comfort. And eventually, you burn out. When boundaries emerge, relationships change. Some become more respectful. Some become more distant. Some disappear entirely. This is not loss. It's differentiation. You begin to see which connections were real and which relied on your silence. And this clarity, while initially painful, is profoundly stabilizing. Because you stop negotiating your worth through endurance. It's important to understand that fear of conflict is not just a thought pattern. It's stored in the body. Your heart rate increases. Your throat tightens. Your breath becomes shallow. These reactions were learned. At some point, speaking up felt unsafe, so your nervous system adapted. And now, even when the danger is gone, the reaction remains. This is why courage doesn't begin in the mind. It begins in regulation. When you speak despite discomfort, when you let your body experience the anxiety without retreating, something powerful happens. Your nervous system updates. It learns, I can survive this. I am not in danger. I don't disappear when I speak. This is how confidence is built, not through positive thinking, but through lived evidence. Every small confrontation you face consciously rewrites your internal map of the world, and slowly your body stops reacting as if every disagreement is a threat to survival. There's another psychological pattern worth naming. People who suppress their own assertive energy often become fascinated or disturbed by those who express it openly. They admire strong personalities from a distance or resent them intensely. Why? Because those individuals are living out what was denied. When you don't allow yourself to be direct, assertive people can feel overwhelming, not because they are cruel, but because they activate something unresolved within you. This is why reclaiming your own voice reduces envy, resentment, and judgment. You stop projecting power outward. You bring it home. And once you do, strength in others no longer threatens you. It inspires you. As this work deepens, something subtle changes. You no longer need to prove yourself. You no longer rehearse arguments endlessly. You no longer fantasize about confrontation, because you trust yourself to respond when the moment arrives. This trust is the foundation of calm. You speak when it matters. You stay silent when it doesn't. Not from fear, but from choice. And that distinction changes everything. Your presence becomes grounded. Your words carry weight. Your silence has meaning. People sense this. They may not consciously know why, but they feel it. This is the paradox of assertion. When you stop avoiding conflict, you actually encounter less of it, because clarity prevents escalation, because boundaries remove ambiguity, because people know where you stand. Finally, it's worth asking a difficult question. What happens if you never change? If you continue avoiding discomfort? If you keep swallowing truth? If you keep mistaking endurance for virtue? The answer is not dramatic. It's quiet. Life narrows. Energy diminishes. Resentment calcifies. You may function. You may succeed externally, but something essential remains untouched, unlived, and deep down, you'll know. Not because you failed, but because you never fully arrived. Reclaiming your voice is not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming whole. And that wholeness requires the courage to stand in tension without collapsing. That is not cruelty. That is psychological maturity. Fear of conflict doesn't only appear in conversations. It quietly shapes the entire architecture of your life. It influences the jobs you accept, the relationships you tolerate, the dreams you abandon before they even fully form. Many people don't choose their path. They drift into it by avoiding resistance. They stay in careers that drain them, because leaving would require uncomfortable conversations. They remain in relationships that shrink them, because asserting needs feels dangerous. They avoid opportunities, not because they lack ability, but because visibility invites judgment. And so they tell themselves stories. It's not the right time. I should be grateful. I don't want to rock the boat. But beneath those explanations is often a familiar pattern. Avoidance disguised as practicality. This is how fear of conflict becomes fear of life itself. Because life, by its nature, demands friction. Growth requires tension. Creation requires exposure. If you remove conflict entirely, you don't get peace. You get stagnation. Another hidden motive behind conflict avoidance is the need to be understood. Many people hesitate to speak because they want their words to land perfectly. They want agreement, validation, clarity without resistance. But real communication doesn't work that way. Being understood is not something you can control. You can speak honestly and still be misunderstood. You can act with integrity and still be judged. When your self-expression depends on being received well, you surrender your agency. You start editing yourself in advance, anticipating objections, diluting your truth to minimize friction. Over time, this creates a strange inner split. You know who you are, but you don't fully express it. You feel things deeply, but articulate them cautiously. You think clearly, but speak softly. And eventually, people relate not to you, but to a filtered version of you, which creates a quiet loneliness, because you're surrounded, yet unseen. The courage to face conflict includes accepting this reality. Not everyone will understand you, and that's not a failure. That's adulthood. Silence often feels safer because it gives the illusion of control. When you don't speak, nothing escalates. No reactions, no surprises. But this control is temporary. Unspoken tensions don't dissolve. They migrate. They appear as passive aggression, emotional distance, chronic dissatisfaction. Eventually, what was avoided externally becomes unavoidable internally. Your body carries it. Your mood reflects it. Your energy diminishes. This is why long-term silence often leads to sudden emotional eruptions. Not because the person is unstable, but because they ran out of internal storage. Conflict avoided today becomes conflict magnified tomorrow. Facing it early is not recklessness, it's maintenance. At its core, assertion is not about winning, it's about self-respect. When you assert yourself, you're sending a message inward. My experience matters. My limits are real. My presence has weight. This message stabilizes the psyche. It reduces inner chaos. It aligns thought, emotion, and action. Without this alignment, people often feel fragmented. They think one thing, feel another, do a third, and that fragmentation creates anxiety. Assertion, even when uncomfortable, brings coherence. You become someone you can rely on, and that internal reliability is the foundation of confidence. An important moment often arrives when you begin asserting yourself consistently. Some people respond well. They adjust. They respect the new boundaries. Others escalate. They push harder, guilt you, test limits. This is not accidental. When someone benefits from your lack of boundaries, your growth feels like a loss to them. So they attempt to restore the old dynamic. Understanding this prevents confusion. You stop asking, why are they reacting like this? And start recognizing, this reaction confirms the necessity of the boundary. Boundaries reveal dynamics that were always present, but hidden. And once revealed, you can choose consciously. Stay, adjust, or step away. Choice replaces obligation. Guilt is one of the most powerful tools of self-suppression, especially for those conditioned to prioritize harmony. You may feel guilty for saying no, for disappointing others, for choosing yourself. But guilt does not always signal wrongdoing. Often, it signals conditioning. You were taught that self-assertion equals selfishness, that discomfort in others is your responsibility. That peace requires sacrifice. Rewriting this belief is essential, because responsibility for others' emotions is not kindness, it's overreach. Healthy assertion allows others to manage their own reactions, and that, paradoxically, is more respectful. Facing conflict is not about eliminating fear. It's about expanding your tolerance for discomfort. Confidence is not calmness without anxiety. It's calmness despite anxiety. Each time you stay present in discomfort, without fleeing or attacking, your capacity grows. You become harder to destabilize. Not rigid, not cold, but grounded. And grounded people don't need to control situations. They respond. There is a crucial distinction to make. Silence is not inherently weak. Silence chosen consciously can be powerful, but silence chosen out of fear is costly. The goal is not to speak all the time. The goal is to be able to speak, to know that if something matters, you will respond, and that knowledge alone changes how you move through the world. You no longer shrink preemptively. You no longer negotiate your worth silently. You no longer disappear to keep things smooth. You exist fully, even when it's uncomfortable. As this capacity develops, something unexpected happens. Life becomes lighter, not because problems disappear, but because you trust yourself to handle them. You stop scanning for threats, stop rehearsing future conversations, stop bracing for imagined conflict. Your attention returns to the present. Energy once trapped in tension becomes available for creativity, connection, and purpose. This is not dramatic liberation. It's subtle, but it's real. At the deepest level, fear of conflict is rarely about others. It's about losing belonging, approval, identity. But the cost of preserving belonging through self-erasure is steep, because the more you abandon yourself, the less there is left to belong as. True connection requires presence. Presence requires voice. Voice requires courage. And courage is not loud, it's quiet. It's the decision to stay with yourself when tension arises, again and again. Avoiding conflict may keep life quiet, but it also keeps it small. It trades intensity for safety, truth for comfort. dignity for approval. And while that trade may feel reasonable in the moment, it compounds over time. The question is not whether conflict will appear in your life. It will. The question is whether you will meet it consciously or let it shape you from the shadows. Because every time you choose silence over truth, something in you retreats. And every time you choose to speak, even imperfectly, something in you comes alive. That is not aggression. That is life asserting itself. And learning to stand in that space may be the most important psychological work you ever do.